I started.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah. So we are live for today's session. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank Think India group in India to give us this platform to have an online discussion. Today's format will be we have two young, energetic individuals who will be the moderating our session for today, and they will be introducing our speaker for today, and they have prepared really tough questions for our speaker. And so I would like to first introduce Parth Parihar, who is currently a PhD candidate in the economics department at Princeton University, and his current work focuses on political economy, bargaining theory, and collective action problems. He's also currently serving as Director of Advocacy for Hindu Student Council, collegiate organization serving college campuses across North India, and he's a former contributor to the Huffington Post on the issues related to India's political economy. The second moderator for today is Kiran Muthal. He's a financial professional working since 2004 as an advisory manager, focusing on financial risk management. He volunteers for service in an Indian think tank along with other community organizations working for Indian national interest. With that, I would like to take opportunity to hand Parth over to you. Parth, you are on mute.
Sorry. Thank you everybody for joining our Facebook Live this morning or this evening, wherever you are. I would like to begin just by introducing our esteemed guest today. So Yudhijit Bhattacharjee will be our guest. He is a contributing writer at the National Geographic and a contributor to the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, and many other publications. A graduate of IIT Mumbai, Yudhijit spent 11 years as a staff writer at Science Magazine, and he is also the author of a New York Times best-selling nonfiction thriller, The Spy Who Couldn't Spell. His latest work, The Dinner Set Gang, will be released by Amazon's Audible later this year, and we can't wait for that. So thank you so much, Yudhijit, for joining us here today on Think India's Facebook platform.
Oh, thank you so much, Parth, for having me on. I hope you guys can hear me all right. Just give me a signal. And thank you, Think India. Thank you, Tushar. Thanks, Kiran. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, definitely. So to get us started today, Kiran Bhai, would you like to ask the first question?
Yes, I'll start. So Yudhijit, let me start by asking you a personal question.
Sure.
So you went to IIT Bombay, you studied chemical engineering, but you chose an unconventional career for an IT grad. I would have seen you normally on a Wall Street or somewhere in a research lab doing research. But you are doing something else. So on a light note, this reminds me of R. Madhavan from Three Idiots. But I read in your Facebook post that your father encouraged you to study humanities.
Yes.
I have a very similar story. So I studied engineering exactly like you, but I was very much interested in political science. So I got another degree in political science, but I couldn't gather the courage to focus only on my interest and do something different. So my question to you is, what made you to choose journalism and how your engineering background help you? Is there any advice that you would like to give to engineering graduates like me who also want to do something different than what we are doing now?
Sure, sure. Well, thank you, Karen, for that question. It does help to introduce. It's the perfect question to allow me to introduce myself. So yes, you're right. I graduated from the Indian Institute of Technology, Powai, in 1994. I studied chemical engineering there. And it's also true that my dad unlike many Indian dads that I know, encouraged me to go into the humanities before I went into IIT. Even though I had gotten through that competitive exam, the joint entrance exam, he wondered if that was the right choice for me. And of course, I was just going into IIT because, that's where many of my academically strong friends were going. And so I decided to pursue that path. But once I got to IIT, I realized that I really wasn't the right candidate for engineering. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't do very well at IIT. And, it was thanks to the kindness of many professors and my friends at IIT that I was able to graduate on time. So not a stellar student by any stretch of the imagination. But while I was at IIT, I had started to kind of pursue my writing interest, which I had back in high school. I was the editor of my school magazine. I used to write for the local newspaper. I grew up in Jaipur, Rajasthan. And so I just kind of went back to, that writing phase or that writing interest. And I started to write poetry about the intersection between science, technology, and society. And thought that, okay, maybe there is, there is some utility to be had from my engineering studies that maybe I could contribute to the humanities, but bring sort of the engineering perspective to the humanities. Anyway, so that didn't go anywhere. I writing poetry and making a living is extremely tough. So I looked for a writing career. And yes, you might say it was an act of courage to try. I got a job at a company called Ambuja Cements right out of college, and I could have continued there, but my heart was really not in that job, and so I quit, and I started looking for a job either in copywriting. So I went to a number of ad agencies to see if I could become a copywriter. And I also went to some newspapers, and I ended up getting a job at a newspaper. So even though it looks like an act of courage, it really was my only choice at that point to try and make something of my life. And then fortunately things worked out, and I worked at a number of newspapers in India for about 4 years. And while I was working at those newspapers, I specialized in writing about science and technology. So I was able to bring at least some of my background into use. And once I did that, I had enough credentials to try and apply for a graduate program in the U.S., which I did. And I got accepted, and I came to the U.S. in '99, and then started my career here.
Yep, this is encouraging, and if I may can comment on it, with your science and technology background, I looked at your genre. It's mostly non-fictional, which requires a real life research, put things in place, do a lot of analysis, and I guess your IT or technology background is helping you in doing that non-fictional research in your career.
Yes, and since we're on the subject of how I kind of got to where I am today, I came to the U.S., I got my graduate degree, and then I got a job at Science Magazine, writing about astronomy and neuroscience and a number of topics within the realm of science policy. And of course, I was somewhat qualified to try to write about these topics because I'd had enough scientific training, just about enough scientific training to talk to scientists and to ask them questions that were logical and relevant and then comprehend, at least superficially, what they were telling me back. So yes, I started out in science, but then starting about 2008, 2009, I wanted to branch out into not just writing about science, but I wanted to go beyond and write about, about society, about people, about international affairs, and so I kind of brought to those topics the same, the same rigor in reporting that I had learned from doing science reporting. And so that's what became the basis for sort of the next phase of my career, which was writing long form pieces like the one that we'll be discussing in a little bit.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so I'm thank you for the opportunity to tell you about my trajectory.
Yep, that's really interesting and encouraging at the same point of time. Let's move to the topic of the day, and I'll hand over to Parth to kick off that topic.
Yeah, so let's pivot the conversation towards Yudhijit, your most recent piece in the New York Times Magazine, The Terrorist Who Got Away. By the way, for our Facebook audiences, if you do have a question that you think emerges from the conversation that we're having with Yudhijit, feel free to comment it under the video on the Think India platform, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as well. This is a way that you can also be part of our conversation. So Yudhijit, when I was reading your piece, one of the things that I noticed was that it paints a very vivid picture of the way that terror organizations like the Jaish-e-Mohammed operate in Pakistan, and specifically the way that they also receive tacit support from state agencies. So based on your reporting, what are the specific ways in which the ISI in Pakistan and other organs of the state give support to the Jaish and other terror organizations? And the other question that came to mind that's related to this is, since this nexus is fairly well known, is there any type of opposition to this that comes from Pakistani civil society?
Right. Well, those are great questions, and there's a lot of questions embedded within those questions, which is always the mark of a great question. So, just for our audience, why don't I summarize the story just a little bit, because some people might not have had a chance to read it. In fact, I'll start with the story of how I got interested in this story to begin with. This is a story about the Jaish-e-Mohammed and its head, Masood Azhar, that almost every Indian has heard of because of the long history of terrorist incidents that have been orchestrated by the Jaish. And I think that many in our audience probably remember a very tragic moment from 1999, right between Christmas and New Year's, when an Indian Airlines plane was hijacked and flown to Kandahar by 5 hijackers who were all Pakistani. And the plane sat there on the tarmac for 6 days while these hijackers negotiated with the Indian government for the release of 3 terrorists who were being held in an Indian prison at the time. And the main terrorist among these 3 was a guy named Masood Azhar, who went on to then establish the Jaish-e-Mohammed. He was part of a different organization at the time that he had been arrested. But once he was released, he went back to Pakistan and then started this organization called the Jaish. So I was actually in Canada at the time when I got news of this hijacking, and like many Indians, I was horrified. And I thought, how could this be happening? How could just 5 people, on a plane be dictating to a powerful country like India what should be done with three terrorists, who had been, they've been charged. They hadn't been convicted, but they've been charged with a number of terrorism crimes in Jammu and Kashmir. And so that moment sort of stayed with me, and like many of you, I saw those visuals of the airplane on the tarmac, of the Indian officials sort of coming in, and then finally Masood Azhar and the other two terrorists sort of being flown in from India to Kandahar, and then making off. In the convoy of vehicles commandeered by the Talibanis. So that stayed with me, and then in 2010, that was close to 11 years after this incident, I happened to have lunch with the official who had been the Director General of the Jammu and Kashmir Police at the time that the incident took place. And he had been actually in charge of transporting Masood Azhar from the prison where he was being held to New Delhi so that he could be flown to Kandahar. And so from him, I got a sense of what a big deal this had been. And so that's what set me on course to try and investigate what had happened to these hijackers, because it seemed to me so obvious that that terrorists who had been freed through an act of terrorism would surely have to be prosecuted in Pakistan under any kind of international norms that we're aware of. And the fact that nobody was talking about this, the fact that this had been completely forgotten, and the fact that that the Jaish, that Masood Azhar had gone on to openly establish a terrorist outfit, which then had been implicated with evidence in a number of terrorist incidents, including the attack on the Indian Parliament in December of 2001. I mean, it was just mind-boggling, and the fact that neither the United States nor any of the European powers were pressing Pakistan to find those 5 hijackers and hand them over to India for due judicial process, and arrest Masood Azhar and hand him over. It just seemed so bizarre. I was like, how is this even happening? So that's what led me to try to write the story, even though so many years had passed. In fact, the story seemed necessary because so many years had passed without any action. And of course, as many in our audience probably remember, the Jaish orchestrated the attack on the Pathankot Air Base in January of 2016. And then there were a number of other incidents. And then finally, the incident in Pulwama a little over a year ago in February of 2019, when this Jaish operative, Adil Dar, ended up killing more than 40 of India's security personnel in Jammu and Kashmir. So that's sort of the summary of the story. And I'll address the couple of questions you asked. You asked about Pakistani support to the Jaish. Well, think about it. I mean, this is a terrorist who was allowed free passage from Afghanistan into Pakistan. As I report in the story, he was going around giving sermons at mosques and giving public lectures, just a few months or a few weeks after he had been released. I spoke to one Indian diplomat who happened to be in Karachi on the very day. I think this was just days after he had returned to Pakistan, that he was making a public speech, and he was, he had a full convoy of security vehicles escorting him to this public place where he was going to give his speech. So I don't think you need any more evidence of public support once you've kind of understood what kind of status Masood Azhar enjoyed in Pakistan after he came back. And of course, we can talk more about other specific sort of evidence that shows that Pakistan's ISI was fully supportive of Masood Azhar. I spoke to a well-known scholar, Pakistani scholar, Ayesha Siddiqa, who happens to be from Bahawalpur, which is the city where Masood Azhar established his base. And she told me that she had spoken to several neighbors of Masood Azhar, and she had spoken to people that knew Masood Azhar. She's even spoken to, people in Masood Azhar's family. And she told me that these neighbors used to watch, people from the security agencies arrive at Masood Azhar's residence, drop off supplies, or, the fact that the state was providing logistical support for the establishment of this outfit was obvious to people in Bahawalpur. So this is not a figment of India's imagination. And I don't think even Pakistan, Pakistani government officials with a straight face would ever make that argument anymore. In fact, Parvez Musharraf and Imran Khan have both acknowledged publicly that that it was Pakistani intelligence that propped up, outfits like the Jaish and Lashkar-e-Toiba. I think you had a second question. I don't know if I'm now wandering too much from the ambit of your.
No, it's fine. Listening to it really does bring all the events that you are speaking about come to life, as if you're watching a movie. The secondary question, just very briefly, was: is there any type of opposition to this nexus that comes from Pakistani civil society?
Right. Well, believe it or not, there is. There is, and I think that opposition really started to grow after India's response to Pulwama. After the air raids, after the Balakot strikes, is really how I should have described them. Now, I've seen video clips of TV panels in Pakistan where people from civil society or journalists have been asking these questions. They've been asking, why should the Pakistani people have to pay the price for this policy of supporting terrorist outfits? And it's true that the Pakistani people have paid a big price over the years, because they also have been victims of terrorist attacks organized by some of these same outfits. Whenever there was a fallout between these outfits and the Pakistani government. In fact, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, tried to assassinate Parvez Musharraf back in, I think it might have been in 2004 or 2005, I forget. It's in the story. So Pakistan has suffered. Okay, Pakistani people have suffered because the Pakistani military has decided to never give up the use of terrorism in order to hurt India and to accomplish its strategic goals. And there's increasing pressure from Pakistani civil society on on the ISI, on the army. And in fact, when I quote people like Hussein Haqqani and Ayesha Siddiqa, these people, they're Pakistani scholars. Hussein Haqqani was Pakistan's ambassador to the U.S. for several years. These are people who are not, friendly to the Indian government. They don't particularly like the Indian government. I'm sure they have many issues with how India functions, with the Indian army, but these are people who have been saying for years that this policy of using terrorism, using terrorist outfits is wrong, that Pakistan needs to stop it, that the Pakistani military needs to abandon this policy. And so I think that, I'm really not an expert on Pakistan per se. I mean, I'm an expert on this story because
No,
I
but
wrote the story.
on the same line, Yudhijit. So
Yeah.
I understood the civil part of it, but when you are saying the ISI and Pakistani army was helping it, if we look at the timeline from Masood was released in 1999 till now, Pakistan has seen 8 prime ministers who are leaning from left to the center to ultra right, and one military dictatorship where Pervez Musharraf has strongly curbed on multiple parts of terrorism. It might be in Northwest Frontier Province or in the Kashmir, and it might be because of multiple reasons. It might be U.S. presence in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but considering the change of government so many times, how Masood managed to continue his activities against Indian government? Has he changed his loyalties or ideologies towards the government in order to continue his terrorist activities?
Okay, so that's a great question, and I'm going to be able to provide only an unsatisfactory answer at best, and that's because I doubt that I doubt that there are people in Pakistan or within the ISI who'd be able to answer this question correctly, but. You first have to understand that Pakistan really has always had these two power centers. You've got the Pakistani government, the democratically elected government. Imran Khan right now is the representative of that. And then you've got this sort of, people talk about deep state in the United States, but Pakistan really has a truly deep state where the ISI and the military, they are really in control. They're in control of internal security. They're in control, of course, of defense matters, and they're in control of foreign policy, especially foreign policy towards India. So I think, I think the answer to your question is that Masood Azhar did not really change loyalties so much. I mean, these are people who the ISI cultivated Masood Azhar. And there were times, in this 20-year span when Masood Azhar sort of disappeared from public view because of pressure from the United States. And in fact, that's where we are again today. After the Balakot strikes, there's been no news of, there have been no major attacks by the Jaish, not that they aren't trying, not that they aren't organizing and planning and plotting, because there are intelligence reports about that as well. But all that Jaish had to do was to kind of go underground for a little while, when Pervez Musharraf was cracking down because of American pressure. But ultimately, they have a huge stronghold. They've managed to create sort of these fortified bases, like in Bahawalpur. They've gone around performing little acts of charity, for instance. So they, the Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, they don't exist in a vacuum. They're not just like paratroopers, on an island. They do have their own links in civil society. And they operate out of these conservative bases where they've managed to brainwash everyone that unless we take Kashmir from India, we're not doing justice in the eyes of Allah, and that it is really a religious imperative to try and take Kashmir, and that's what makes it such a difficult problem, because of the use of religion as a tool for manipulating a large number of people. So when we're talking about those TV debates that I mentioned, where you had, because there are lots of right-thinking people in Pakistan. I mean, there's bound to be, I mean, they're just like us. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that a whole country is completely brainwashed. No.
Sure. So since you mentioned brainwashing, I wanted to move to our next question, which is related to it. So your piece narrates the arc, really, of Masood Azhar's story from where he started out to, the incident where he's released by the Vajpayee government, to then how he creates the Jaish-e-Mohammed and everything that happens afterwards. So going back to the beginning, Masood Azhar starts out as a propagandist for the Harkatul Mujahideen, as you note in your story. So how did that role that he started out in help shape the way that propaganda is used by the Jaish, the organization that he started? And since we're talking about the media in Pakistan, do organizations like the Jaish have any indirect influence over segments of the Pakistani media that help give them the type of open cover and eventually public support that allows them to operate?
Right. So, the answer to your first question is that absolutely. I think Masood Azhar's training as a propagandist, as the editor of this magazine that the Harkatul Mujahideen used to bring out, that is really where he trained to be kind of the intellectual jihadist, because Masood Azhar is not a fighter himself. He's never commanded people in battle, but he was kind of the philosophical, intellectual guru of terrorists. That's how he kind of built himself up, somewhat like Hafiz Saeed in the Lashkar-e-Toiba. And what he did was, in that magazine, he used to write these accounts of mujahideen who had died in Afghanistan, in repelling the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. He would also glorify, terrorists in Kashmir who had killed Indian security forces and then been killed themselves. And so he sort of realized the power of sort of glorifying this, supposed martyrdom. I'm putting it in air quotes because it's, from their perspective, it's martyrdom, but really it's criminals being killed by the police or by security agencies. And I think we've come a long way since the 90s. I mean, in the 90s, people still would talk about militancy as being sort of half legitimate, that after all, it's just a tool of war. If it's a people who are fighting against repression, then they might be able to use militancy. And after 9/11, that definition has become clear that terrorism is terrorism, and you cannot make any excuses for it, which is why we find ourselves in this new climate today where, Pakistan is unable to find any support for, for even tacitly providing some kind of moral cover to terrorists and terrorist outfits in Kashmir. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think on the same topic, right? So how his propaganda and media was playing a role together. On the same topic, these are different small terrorist organizations, Yudhijit. So if you look at the timeline, Masood Azhar started in Harkatul Mujahideen, then got arrested. When he was released, he started his own organization, which was Jaish-e-Mohammed in 1999. So if you speak in New York or San Francisco language, he left one of the big firm to start his own startup.
Right.
Now, his startup, but very interesting thing is his startup grew up very quickly. And though there are different organizations, they also compete with each other. There are reports that there is infighting and conflicts between these organizations. So, but still, his startup was able to grow up quickly and able to eat up space for some of the big players that were already present. So, your piece mentioned about his allegiance to Al Qaeda, Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden. So, how did he manage to grow his organization that quickly? Is it solely based on his talent, or was it put forward by Pakistani agencies, or his closeness to Laden and Al Qaeda that helped him to gain the momentum?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think for sure, his own projection as a hero, because he had received so much publicity after this hijacking. That's what gave him a public face and a public persona that he did not enjoy earlier. And so he was able to raise more funds, than many of these competing outfits, to the point that some of these outfits, their fighters and their members came and joined the Jaish-e-Mohammed. To use the same startup language, it's like many of the employees of the big firm, of the pre-existing firm, leave and then join, the 4 or 5 people who've established the startup. That's what happened. And so when he announced the formation of the Jaish-e-Mohammed in Bahawalpur in the year 2000, there were lots of other outfits that came, and some of those people just merged with the Jaish-e-Mohammed, and that's how Jaish-e-Mohammed's ranks grew. I think he was also very successful in raising money, and that, I think, was because of his charisma as a public speaker. I think he was definitely one of the more talented speakers. So he was able to give sermons at mosques. He was able to attract local businessmen and farmers and convince them that his organization was the one to invest in. I mean, again, to use the same language.
This is the same point. We will stick to the same point when you said there are people from different organizations and different part of the world came and joined him. So that shows he might have a global role, or he might be playing a global role in the terrorism, which was kind of a localized in nature. There is an audience question coming in from Facebook Live, which is about was Masood Azhar charged as a man who was instrumental in bringing terror to Britain and in the same continent? So, though that terror was localized in Kashmir, Afghanistan, Southeast Asia subcontinent, but was it true that he was part of Britain terrorism module? And other question is, there are 2 things I find very daunting in your article. First is he used Portuguese passport to travel to India. The conventional route of all Pakistani terrorists to enter India was either through the porous border, if not through Bangladesh or Nepal. I think this is the first kind of a radical experiment or disruption Masood brought, where he used the European passport, which did not bring anyone's notice. If you look at the timeline, within 8 years, Abu Salem was also arrested from Lisbon, Portugal. So we saw Masood role in Britain. We saw Masood using Portuguese passport. Abu Salem was in Portugal. So what's that in Europe, or specifically in Portugal, that terrorists use that country to take cover?
Right. Well, I don't think I have a an honest answer, a clear answer to the use of the Portuguese passport. I think that, but you're right that Masood Azhar had a role to play in fomenting terrorism in the United Kingdom, because in 1992 or 1993 it was that he made a trip to the UK, and he gave various speeches at mosques that are attended by Pakistani expatriates, and he definitely kind of introduced the ideas of terrorism, of jihad. I'm not sure that they didn't exist prior, because all of these things, you look at a point in history and then there's history before that. But certainly the speeches that he gave there, which he then wrote about, in his magazine. So that's how we have documentation of the kinds of things, of the kinds of sermons that he gave at these mosques. And I'm sure that, British intelligence, today has probably connected some dots and has connected, the acts of some of the terrorist incidents that Britain has suffered, has connected them to, to inspiration provided by Masood Azhar, to guidance provided by Masood Azhar and his associates. So the idea that Masood Azhar is not just a terrorist with respect to Kashmir, that he's a global terrorist, is beyond doubt. No question about that. As far as why he used a Portuguese passport, why Portuguese, I'm sure that there's probably an answer to that question. It's just not one that I know or can speak definitively about.
Okay.
Sure. So I wanted to also bring our attention back to the climax of your piece, which is the Kandahar hijacking and the release of Masood Azhar along with 2 other terrorists as a result of that, right? So in your piece, you specifically quote an Indian intelligence official, C.D. Sahai, as saying that when the Indian side was negotiating over the hostages, C.D. Sahai says that they were negotiating with not the terrorists, but with the ISI. That's a direct quote. So based on your reporting here about the Kandahar operation, was the ISI actually the mastermind behind that hijacking? And given the situation that was prevailing on the ground, what other option did the Indian government at the time have besides releasing Masood Azhar? Because this is one of the most contested decisions, and people often say that you should have hindsight or whatever, but like at the time, what other options was the government seriously considering?
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And, whenever I hear any criticism of any government, just with a critical mind, my first question is, well, what would you have done? Until you have a solid response to the question of like, what would you have done? I'm always wary of criticism. So I'll come to that question later, but you asked, I guess the first part of your question was whether the ISI was behind the hijacking. And, of course, we don't have conclusive evidence, because in the intelligence world, it's difficult to really piece together, cables and documents and show that here was the ISI guy who was talking to the Kandahar, to the ATC. But I asked Sahai this question, and this is not in the story, but I asked him how he knew that these were the ISI. So if you recall, there were a lot of international media that had gathered in Kandahar to cover this hijacking because the negotiations were going on. And many of these foreign journalists, from the US, from Europe, they had they had a, they used to talk to people like Sahai as well in India, right? So these were journalists who were known to the Indian intelligence establishment, to the Indian diplomats who were there. And these foreign journalists said, oh, I just saw so-and-so coming out of, the ATC, or I just saw so-and-so close to the airport. And in fact, I have a picture, and they would say, oh, this person is from the ISI in Islamabad, or is from the ISI here. So the presence of known ISI functionaries in Kandahar at the time is really what clinches, this this assertion that the ISI was behind the hijack. And seen broadly, of course, what happens after the hijacking is as much evidence of the same fact, which is that these terrorists end up, getting safe passage out of Afghanistan into Pakistan. All the hijackers get safe passage, and then there's no prosecution. And Masood Azhar is going around, making public speeches and glorifying his escape from Indian custody. How's that possible without the ISI having been involved? And then, of course, everything that follows in the 15, 20 years that come after is also proof of the same thing. Now, your second question was about whether this was, this could have been avoided, whether, this was a good decision to release these terrorists in exchange for the hostages. I know that the government didn't have a choice. I just know that at the time, it's easy for us to sit in our armchairs and say, things like, we should have done what Israel does, or things that, that a lot of people in India sort of say, when, every time we have a situation like that. And really, I mean, can you imagine 170, 180 passengers on that plane, their families, they're sobbing in front of the Prime Minister's residence in Delhi. I mean, this is India we're talking about. This is not China,
No, and even Israel, you made reference to Israel, Yudhijit.
Yeah.
There are a couple of examples where Israel had a commando operation, but there are also numerous examples where Israel has released multiple terrorists, not militants, multiple terrorists for 1-2 soldiers which have been captured in the West Bank or Gaza.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I think where that government, the Vajpayee government, would be to blame, I think, is when the plane was sitting on the tarmac in Amritsar, where there was an opportunity to perhaps intervene and not let the plane take off. That's where, but that's more of a tactical error. That's more of a lapse in security. And then, of course, everything that came before, the Portuguese passport, all the elements of the plot that culminated in the hijacking, there were probably lapses in security or, but I don't think it was an option to let these hijackers blow up a plane filled with 200 Indians in order to keep Masood Azhar in prison. I don't think that, and also, think about it, the Indians, diplomats, just one thing, these people probably were thinking that, okay, we'll first get our citizens back from Kandahar, and then we're going to launch a diplomatic offensive so that Pakistan is forced to arrest these. They tried that, they tried that for years, and it just didn't work because Pakistan was definitely a rogue state then, and some might say it continues to be a rogue state today.
Right. So going off of that last bit about looking forward to what's happening today, many of our viewers will be familiar with the history of what's transpired as a result of releasing Masood Azhar, all of his activities with the Jaish-e-Mohammed, So coming back to closer to the present day, the UN Security Council recently put Masood Azhar on its sanctions list, after which the Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan said that we will not allow armed militias to operate anymore. Are statements like that a genuine attempt to change course? And specifically, one of the things that our audience member is also asking is whether Pakistan has gone after madrasas, which are seen to be involved in radicalizing and recruiting members to these organizations. So have there been those types of genuine attempts, or are statements like this just an eyewash to try and distract from the international pressure?
Right. Well, if history is any guide, then these statements certainly seem like an eyewash, because the only bit of news that might give us reason for cautious optimism is the conviction and sentencing of Hafiz Saeed, who has been sentenced to, I think, I don't know if the sentencing has been done, but he is going to be locked up. He's going to be in prison. Now, maybe that'll be a great prison and a very enjoyable one, but it will be, he's definitely been convicted and he's going to face some consequences. But in terms of, maybe they're sacrificing Hafiz Saeed so they can keep all the other outfits alive, because Hafiz Saeed, might be past his prime and, they no longer have any use for him. I really can't say, but I think that, in 2016, after the attack on Pathankot, the Modi government invited, at the time, Nawaz Sharif was the prime minister. He spoke to Nawaz Sharif. I think Nawaz Sharif called Modi, and then Modi invited an investigative team, including members of the ISI, to come to India to collaborate in this investigation. And that was, I think, it was a genuine attempt by the Indian government to give Pakistan a chance to prove its sincerity in ending terrorism in Kashmir. Because if they had followed through on that investigation, and I've seen the documents that were handed to them, all the evidence in the Pathankot air base attack. I mean, there's not a scintilla of doubt that the attack originated or was orchestrated from Pakistani soil. I think I quote in the story intercepts of this phone conversation between one of the terrorists, who was ultimately killed in Pathankot, and that terrorist's mother in Sialkot. And so there was just overwhelming evidence for Pakistan to follow up on and arrest people of the Jaish. So we didn't have to wait until Pulwama,
So, yes, it is. So, and I want to continue on the evidence part. So when you're talking about the different technical evidences, the major piece of evidence is flow of money. The flow of money, which is going to all these terrorist organizations, it's coming from Pakistan itself, or it might be originated from different countries outside Pakistan, might be in Middle East, might be in Europe, anywhere. Pakistan has been put on Financial Action Task Force grey list since 2018. So can you tell us more about how Pakistan is it working towards curbing the money laundering or terror financing network? Because that's impacting their economy in the global arena. So are they working on anything of that effect, and that will boost their image as a country and also improve their economy?
Well, so they certainly claim that they're working on it, and as Exhibit A, and right now we don't have Exhibit B, we only have Exhibit A. As Exhibit A, they point to the conviction of Hafiz Saeed, because Hafiz Saeed has been convicted on terrorism financing charges, not terrorist activity, but terrorism terrorist financing, which is one of the things that Pakistan is trying to show action on, so that it gets removed from that gray list and its economy doesn't suffer. But this also ties into the question that was asked earlier. Maybe it was Parth who asked it, or maybe it was you, Karen. The question about whether there's civil society, opposition to the support that these terrorist outfits get. And I think that opposition is rising because of how the economy is suffering as a result of the squeeze and the pressure being put on Pakistan by this watchdog organization that does the gray listing and the blacklisting and by other international financial organizations. So I think in the long term, and I know that people in America have said the same thing about Iran, that with sanctions, with pressure, ultimately there will be some kind of revolution within Iran, and then Iran will install a government that is friendlier to the world and to the US and so on. And so I guess there are some people in India who think similarly about Pakistan, that ultimately the Pakistani people will overthrow, the ISI's, kind of heavy hand on affairs there, and maybe that'll be the pathway to peace. But it's really hard to say. And I think that I'll end my answer to this question on the note that if Pakistan really meant business, then they could hand over Masood Azhar. They could hand over Masood Azhar. They could hand over those hijackers. They could hand over a number of wanted terrorists, that India has identified and provided evidence for, and say, here, we are going to act on these criminals. We're going to show that we no longer support terrorism, and here's how. So whatever they're doing with respect to Hafiz Saeed, in order to satisfy the Western powers on whom their economy depends, perhaps they could initiate a set of actions that's similar with respect to India to prove their sincerity.
Okay, so there's one specific line in your piece that when I read it, I knew that I had to ask a question about it. So,
sure.
And it's about current events that are happening now. So you say India's revoking of Kashmir's autonomy is bound to be seen by Pakistan's military as a strategic defeat, one that the ISI, which, as we've been talking about, has been complicit in a lot of this terror activity, will be plotting to avenge. So this goes back to the decision to lock down Kashmir in August of this year, following the abrogation of Article 370, which has been one of the most politically contested decisions, not only in India, but also throughout the world, especially here in the US and in the rest of the West broadly.
Sure.
So based on your own reporting and the sense that you got speaking with officials in India, was the decision to shut down the internet and restrict movements in the aftermath of that decision a reasonable response to trying to curb these types of cross-border terror attacks that could have happened? And what specifically will the abrogation of Article 370 do to actually curb that cross-border terror itself? So there's two separate prompts to that question.
Right. And so I don't think, again, just like with the release of Masood Azhar, I don't think the Indian government really had a choice with respect to shutting down the internet. I think that was just a basic security measure that they absolutely needed to put in place once they had decided to go through with the revocation of Article 370. Whether it could have been done, in a more sensible manner, by maybe, letting educational institutions hold on to the internet, by, maybe by having more of sort of a listening capability, eavesdropping capability. I don't know, enough about the technology. And it's funny you should ask me that, because my son, who's in high school, was just writing a paper on this very topic of whether shutting down the internet does indeed help in preventing violence in a zone that is prone to conflict. So I think because the internet now is seen just like drinking water, and it's like, oh my God, no drinking water. It's like, oh my God, no internet. It creates that sort of feeling in the minds of people, and so that's the reason why it was so severely criticized around the world. It's like, oh my God, India's got such a repressive government. They've shut down the internet. I'm sure that caused a lot of hardship to a lot of people, and I don't think you can really defend the hardship, unless you go through it yourself.
No.
I mean, it's the same thing. As unless one of your family members was on that plane on the tarmac, you really don't know what it's like. So, with that caveat, I'll say that that I think that I do agree with what I heard recently. I think the Indian government, or the Jammu and Kashmir administration, said in India's report that the internet is not a fundamental human right. And so until, maybe 5 years from now, it will be declared an international human right, in which case, but by then, you'll bet there will be a lot more technology available to control the internet, should the government decide to do it. So that. And I think you had a second question. What was it? Sorry, I got carried away.
I think we are on very right track to ask the second part of what we were discussing about. We are talking about Kashmir. It's a fight of Kashmir, or independence struggle, we might want to call it, for Kashmir. It has been fought by three major actors: Masood Azhar, Zakirur Rahman Lakhvi, and Hafiz Saeed. There are two common things in all three of them. They all are fighting for Kashmir's independence, and none of them belong to Kashmir.
Right.
So my question to you is, there is a separatist voice in Indian side of Kashmir. It might be All Party Hurriyat Conference or JKLF or any radical fighting force like Majid Dar. But most of them have either surrendered or talking to government or mended their way to join the mainstream. However, we have not seen that. We have not seen any separatist or fighting leaders from Pakistani side of Kashmir, Gilgit-Baltistan, Chitral. Chitral is always ignored. But is it something that a fight for Pakistan-originated fight for this independent Kashmir is something by only Punjabis, and Kashmiris from Pakistani are not involved in it at all? And if that's the case, so that's the first question. Is it only Punjabis fight? And then if that's the case, what do we see a future for a combined future of India and Pakistan Kashmir?
Right. So I think that, yes, you're right that these Pakistani terrorists have been at the forefront of this attempt to separate Kashmir from India, whether it is to make Kashmir independent or whether it is to absorb Kashmir, in Pakistan. I do believe that maybe we're downplaying, the inconvenient truth of there being a separatist movement that has a long history, and we might not like it, because of our political persuasion, but I'm not Kashmiri. I'm not Kashmiri. I have friends who are Kashmiri, but I haven't extensively traveled through Kashmir. But whatever I've read shows that that there are roots to this, this feeling of disenfranchisement, to this feeling of being marginalized. And yes, Pakistan's terrorist outfits have come in and fanned the flames, and they have turned it into a violent movement. But there is something there that we cannot wish away, I think is probably fair to say.
No, absolutely. I agree on that point. But why don't I see the leaders from Pakistani occupied Kashmir? Why all of them are Punjabis?
Right. So that has to do with Pakistan's domestic politics and with the role of the ISI. I mean, with the factionalism, within that country, within that bloc. But I think I'm a little out of my depth here. I'll admit I don't have a good answer for you.
Okay, that's but if most of them are Punjabis, so let's assume, or let's accept the fact that most of the leaders are Punjabis, and we don't see many leaders coming in from Pakistan occupied Kashmir, Gilgit-Baltistan. So do we see a better future if Gilgit-Baltistan for Gilgit-Baltistan Chitral region, if they want to join India as their separatist movement or stay as a pro-Azadi movement?
Right. I do think that here's my kind of imagined utopian scenario, that India and Pakistan come to an agreement where, Pakistan really truly proves that it no longer supports terrorism in Kashmir. And then
I accept that a utopian scenario. And then we can go ahead. Yeah.
All right. But let's say if that were to happen, and maybe that happens because of pressure from India, India's military might, India's, economic prowess in the world, combined with its diplomatic efforts and combined with, with sort of this acceptance all over the world that Pakistan has not behaved, well for decades, which I think is pretty much universally acknowledged at this point. If that were to happen, then perhaps, we could do away with the border between, Pakistani occupied Kashmir and our Kashmir, India's Kashmir, and perhaps at that point you could have, a joint leadership emerging between these two areas. Now, of course, then that would set the stage for, for that part of Kashmir, which is illegally occupied, according to Indians, by Pakistan, of merging into the original Kashmir. I mean, I know where you're going with this. It's just that, I just think that there are so many steps between now and that stage that, that some might say that too is some kind of a fanciful idea. if you were to say that the idea of Pakistan abandoning terrorism as an instrument of state policy is fanciful, then I don't think you can negate the fact that this could also be called fanciful, given the current scenario.
Yep, this is a topic of debate, and we can continue speaking on it. There are multiple actors, even China allowing a country to act as a buffer state, which we have seen not happening. So, yeah, let's move on to new topic.
Yeah. So for just a forward-looking question to maybe close us out. Just wearing my game theory hat a little bit.
Sure.
When a country's behind, when it's disadvantaged, there's two things it can kind of do. It can try to latch on to the country that's moving forward, moving ahead, and try to take up some of their gains by cooperation, or they can double down and just stick with their regional strategy. So there's a conventional view that once India becomes economically advanced, that Pakistan will change course and have greater incentive to befriend India to cooperate. But your piece contends, and this runs through as a thread through pretty much the whole piece, that as Pakistan falls behind economically and militarily, it grows more and more desperate, and it's adopted jihad, it's doubled down on its strategy. So what about the last 2 decades really tell you that that's the case, just to kind of summarize over the kind of arc we've gone through? And what does that mean from your point of view about Indo-Pak relations moving forward? Where is this all heading?
Well, I'm a bit of an optimist, and maybe foolishly so. But I've talked to a lot of young Pakistani people, that I've met at airports, on airplanes, and of course, you become the best of friends when when you meet in those circumstances, even though your countries are at war, essentially. So I believe that aspirations of the younger generation are so strong, that they really want economic development for themselves and their families. And maybe this is a familiar refrain, and maybe we've heard all of this before, because in every era there's a young generation, and that young generation is more liberal and is more desirous of economic development and technological advancement and things like that, and is more indifferent to kind of the conservative ideas of that society. But I still remain optimistic because of the internet, because there are so many people-to-people interactions in today's world, a lot more than there used to be in the 60s and 70s and 80s, that I do think that there's room for fresh, constructive dialogue between younger people, such as the audience that's engaging with us today, and there's probably a similar audience on the Pakistani side, which would agree with most of the things that we are saying. They might have some differences, but they're so I do think that that as long as we don't shut all the doors for dialogue, and this is what Vajpayee was trying to do, and yes, it's true that he got stabbed in the back, but he was genuinely making an attempt. And you can't deny that, being an economist, that the statistical distribution of people in any culture is probably similar. You've got a vast number of people under the curve, who are similar, who want, they want good food, they want good music, they want the freedom to love and marry who they want, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got, some people on the edges of the curve who might use violence, or maybe I'm straying from your exact question, but I think that there's hope that that instead of going the other way, you painted the negative scenario, that the arrow of history will point towards the more positive scenario.
That's a very optimistic approach towards of looking towards the future, Yudhijit. This was really an engaging and interesting discussion. You covered most of the areas. You answered all of our questions. This is we look forward for more interactions in the future. I will say that this interaction has reached more than 10,000 audience. So this is a very good success for us. We have successfully educated or able to reach out to multiple audience to educate them about this issue. We would
thank you so much. We would like
to have a closing remark from you, and after your closing remark, Tushar wants to make a quick announcement. And we will end our presentation or interview after that. So Over to you for your closing remark.
Well, thank you very much, Kiran. Thank you, Parth. Those were really well-informed and smart questions, and you made me think. I hope that I was able to answer at least some of them. I've now lived in America for 20 years. I'm an American citizen, although I'm also an overseas citizen of India. I love my roots. I love India. I'm so glad that you gave me an opportunity to engage with young people like yourselves. I'm amazed every time I go to India, and meet people, and there's just tremendous energy, intelligence, talent. I mean, it's really like there's no country like India. So thank you very much. I'll put in a plug for two things. One is the book that you mentioned, The Spy Who Couldn't Spell. It's available on Amazon, published by Penguin. It's a New York Times bestseller. I know everyone's under lockdown these days, so buy it on Kindle or buy it on Amazon and read it. And then secondly, I have a new book coming out in the form of an audiobook called The Dinner Set Gang. This is a true story of a couple of jewel thieves from 1960s and 70s. It's an amazing tale. I hope you guys will look out for the release. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Yudhijit.
Dr. Shah, you wanted to make an announcement before we closed out.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Parth and Kiran, for your outstanding preparation for today's session. I think Yudhijit, you were successful in stepping him out of his comfort zone and, love some of the questions. So I just want to have an announcement that on May 11th, we will be live back again through Think India page. And we will be talking to Arvind Gupta, who is the head and co-founder of Digital India Foundation, which is a policy think tank working in areas of digital inclusion and smart cities. We'll be talking about how Indian government is using Digital India and the technology to counter and to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. So it will be a similar session. I will be joined by my colleagues from National University Singapore and from Princeton. So we will be bringing more such session. If you have any comments, do approach us and we will try to see if we can arrange session on topics of your interest. So thank you once again, Yudhijit, for accepting our invitation. And with this, I think we will meet you guys again next week.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Yudhijit. Thank you very much.